when the riots occurred, I think many people in the leadership sector of the country, and especially white liberals, began to question whether or not they were on the right track. And the group known as Neoconservatives began to emerge. They were people who began to say, well, maybe it really isn't a problem of economic inequality. There are some other forces at work here. Values, attitudes, and behavior. Maybe it's culture. You began to hear about this thing called the culture of poverty. Maybe it is something within the people themselves rather than the objective conditions of their disadvantage that explains why they are not advancing more, and maybe we've been doing the wrong thing all the time, so perhaps we should reduce this spending and move in a different direction. A very important memorandum was written in 1970. I believe that was a year, by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who in 1964 wrote a very famous report on the Negro family, in which he attributed many of the conditions of economic disadvantage in the black community to a breakdown of the black family. He had misread the previous literature, let me say. But by 1970, he was in the White House as Richard Nixon's principal domestic advisor. And he wrote a memorandum in which he suggested that the federal government's high visibility concentration on these problems might itself be the problem, that the country was ripe for benign neglect. He claimed that the way to deal with these problems was to draw attention away from them. We needed benign neglect, he said. Well, it was an exceedingly poor choice of words. And it was an indication, though, of the so-called neoconservative thinking that pervaded the body politic at that time and led to a shifting away from the kind of high visibility government concentration on urban problems reflected in such programs as the Model Cities program, the Great Society programs. And of course, in the late 1960s, the early 1970s, the funding for those programs was reduced rather sharply. Many of the white businesses that remained moved out. They threw in the towel. They just decided that it was no longer worth the risk of remaining in those communities, and so most of the communities were absolutely devastated as a result of that. Black businesses did not exist for the most part in many of those communities. White businesses moved out. Anyone who could sell did so. And that left the community substantially devoid of many services and commercial opportunities. Whole stretches of inner city communities were left without the basic necessities: a drugstore, a corner grocery store, supermarkets closed and just left, corner banks. Many of the businesses just moved out of those neighborhoods. Another thing that happened was that the property that had been destroyed as a result of the disturbances was not quickly rebuilt. Many houses that were burned, many commercial dwellings or commercial facilities that were burned were left standing as shells for long periods of time, long after the disturbance had ended. And that was a terrible, terrible eyesore on the community, and eventually many of those structures had to be demolished, and so you could go through a community and find block after block of just leveled, empty lots with weeds growing and so forth. It was a devastating visual result of the disturbances. Another thing happened, though, that is not often mentioned, and that is, as a result of the opening of opportunity during the 1960s through affirmative action and equal employment opportunity, largely urged on employers by the federal government, many black people who had a good education, who had the potential for good employment, obtained that employment. So you began to see the advancement of a group known as the black middle class into many entry-level industry jobs, many of them in managerial jobs. In the early 1960s, people in that category would have lived in the inner city. But with the opening up of housing opportunity in various other sections of the city, as the white population began to move out, in part as a result of the riots, in those inner city communities, you were left with a large concentration of the lower income black people who had no other choices and who had no place to go. So the diversity of the black community, occupational and class diversity that existed in the 1940s and the 1950s, began to break down in the 1960s, so that you were left at the end of the 60s and certainly into the 70s with a monolithic population, very largely poor, very largely dependent on public welfare. That was one of the major results of the changes that we are talking about. And one other change that I found interesting was that the initial reaction of the business community was to turn away from concern with black problems as a result of the disturbances of the 1960s. Now, they later turned their attention back with some prodding from the federal government. But the initial reaction was to turn away from those problems. And that further isolated many of the communities from any redeeming values that otherwise might have ameliorated many of the problems that were created by the disturbances.